Hello, hello, everyone. Hello, hello. Let me know in the comments if you can hear me. I'm always a little bit worried when I use Amelia's computer that you might not hear me all right. Put your name in the chat, tell me where you're from, and let me know if you can hear me or not. If you haven't met me yet before, hi, I'm Nicole. I'm from Team Amelia. I'm a licensed judge and a licensed coach, and I affectionately refer to myself as one of Amelia's substitute teachers. There are a few of us. Amelia is off right now. She is not in California. She's off traveling. So she will be back next week, which is great. And then Herman is also out of town. So you just get little old me. Hope that's okay. See some people in the chat saying hello. Fantastic. Great to see you guys. Um, Tonight we are talking all about half halts, and I'm so super excited. I have 2 pages of notes because I didn't want to forget to tell you guys anything. And I also have questions from the students in Amelia's Dressage Club. So if you have questions as we go, feel free to put them in the chat or save them to the end, whatever you'd like. Or, you ask them in the club later if you have questions. We might be able to help you there. But we've got a great topic, half halts. So hopefully you guys, I can see, like you said, some of you are saying hello. Put in the chat where you're from. I want to start off giving you the definition of half halts because I feel like before we get into the what and the how and the when and all that sort of stuff, we have to first go back to like what it is in a very simple way. So this is the definition from USDF. The half-halt is a hardly visible, almost simultaneous coordination action of the seat, the legs, and the hand of the rider with the object of increasing attention and balance of the horse before the execution of several movements or transitions between the gaits or paces. So I think that's a very big way of describing it, but I do think it's very inclusive and a very good definition of what it is. When I think about a half halt, it's either something that we do to regain the attention of the horse or to help the balance of the horse, increase the balance. And when the other part element of that, like why we do it, the next part of the how, the really important thing that you guys want to keep in mind is that it's the almost simultaneous coordination of the seat, the legs, and the hand. And that's where people sometimes get a little funky is that they try and do all of them at the same time. But even with the most like decorated Grand Prix horse, you don't put them on at the same times because that's like putting your gas and your brake on at the same time, right? You apply clashing aids. So they have to be almost simultaneous. And when we think about it, it's oftentimes people, if they're going too fast and things like that, they're saying half halt, half halt, half halt. It's important to remember that a half halt is not slowing down. A half halt, like I said, is the rebalancing of energy, shifting things onto the hindquarters so that the horse can be more have an or uphill balance and to carry us better. But what often happens is when we rebalance the horse, because they're more balanced, they actually have better control of their tempo and rhythm, and which makes it almost feel like we're slowing down. And also, when we half out, we then can control the speed and the tempo more so. So important to remember that it's almost like the speed control element of a half halt is the symptom of what is happening afterwards, not the actual direct purpose. Um, so great on that. A story I wanted to share about half halts when we talk about the definition. Because a lot of people put in the chat if you have heard any like cool expressions of like what a half halt is. Like sometimes people say it's like a half a halt, like you almost halt, but then you keep going. Some people call it a rebalancing or recycling of energy, things like that. And one of my trainers, when I was working, we were kind of discussing, we're like, it's almost thinking of it as a halt is almost detrimental to you learning how to do it because it's not a halt. You don't stop. And the reins are the last part of your sequence of your legs to your seat to your hand, right? So with that, yeah, Nick's saying I say a half go. Yeah. And so we were talking about it's a half go. And I was like, I wonder if we could teach students that it's not actually a half halt, it's a half go. And so at the time, had taught a lot of like adults that had were coming to me for riding. And also I was teaching like brand new, fresh kidlets that like were just learning how to balance, right? And then I finally got a kid who was about 10 years old and she had never she had no concept. I was the only person who'd ever taught her, and I'd gotten her to a place where she was finally to learn a half halt. And I was like, I'm gonna teach her that it's a half go. And so I was really diligent with her, and I always referred to it as a half go. Like I'd be like, "Oh, don't forget your half go in the corner. Like prepare for your half go before your transition." And it was going really, really well. And I was like, "This is it. This is how we have to teach every student now going forward. It's a half go." And then one day when we were working on something more complicated, I slipped and said half halt. And then she panicked and she's like, "What's a half halt? I don't know what a half halt is." And I was like, "Oh no." And then I had to explain to her that they were the same things. And I was kind of experimenting with her. And she laughed and her mom laughed, thank goodness. And then from then on, we called them half halts. So, but I have used it a few times with other students. It's worked really well. So if there's any coaches listening, feel free to try that with your kidlets because it worked super duper well. But oftentimes when I'm teaching and coaching and things like that at clinics, if you try and change up languages, sometimes it's hard and you slip back into things like I did in that instance. But it worked really, really well for her. um, when we talk about the half halt, I was looking through the questions that everyone submitted beforehand, there was a lot of confusion about like what it is and when it happens and why do we do it and things like that. And so it's important, like we said, it's the rebalancing of energy or attention. So what I think it's important that before we apply a half halt and worry about the timing and what aids we're doing, we have to think about what that end result is that we're looking for, right? Just like when we apply an aid and we wait for the right reaction before we release, it's the same thing with a half halt. The half halt is a combination of aids. It's a more sophisticated set of aids, but we still have to know what that end result is, that reaction from the horse that we're looking for. Um, and so in my mind, when I think about it, it's going back to neutral. So whenever we're riding, we apply aid and then release it. We go back to neutral when we're riding. We should be able to put our horse on a circle. They maintain the cruise control of whatever tempo and gait we put them on, maintain them on the bend before we go into anything more, right? And so with that, we always want to be thinking about going back to that place where we can have them in this beautiful balance that they could do anything that we asked of them. So when I think about, okay, I'm going to do a half halt so I can increase the balance to have that neutral be more on the hindquarters. So then I can do an extended trot, or I can do a shoulder in, or I can do a half pass, or whatever it is. The tricky part comes when you have to get the horse in that balance so where they can maintain it because of their muscling and training to do whatever movement you're doing. And sometimes it's hard because the movements help with the balance. And then also, if your horse isn't used to be in that more collected balance, it's harder for them to maintain it, right? So hopefully that gives you kind of a little bit of an idea of that when we put our aid on for a half halt, it's so that we could then shift their weight back so that then we can ask them to do something that they would find, and they would find it more easy to do it. They'd be in better harmony to do it. It's increasing the throughness and the rideability of your horse, right? So with that, why are half halts so difficult? And the reason why, and I was funny, Amelia and I got asked this on a live about a month ago, and it was like, "Oh, can you explain the half halt?" And we kind of looked at each other and we're like, "Well, it takes hours upon hours to explain the whole essence of half halts because there's so many variables in a half halt. The biggest thing is that they change per horse, and then and depending on if your horse is short backed, long backed, if they're more hot, if they're more laid back, if they're more reactive, if they need to shift their weight more behind, or they need more attention focus, or if they need to be more energized from behind and more active in their hind leg, or if we need to slow them down. And then what happens is then the half halt changes based on like throughout the ride. After your warm up, your half halt is probably going to be different than before your warm up. As your if a different person gets on your horse, they're probably going to feel different, have a slightly different coordination of aids, and their legs are going to hang differently. And so your horse can misinterpret things because they're like, "Oh, it feels different." And then on top of all of that, it changes through the development of the horse. So a half halt on a 3-year-old or a 4-year-old is going to feel very different on a half halt on a 10-year-old or on a horse that's doing first level compared to a Grand Prix, right? And then on top of all that, you have to think about the timing of whatever gait or movement you're in. So the how you know all of those different elements comes from how you feel with your horse. And I don't mean like the touchy-feely things like that, but depending on how much degree of pressure you put on your leg or on your seat or on your right hand or your left hand and things like that will make up the unique formula of a half halt that you need for that horse at that moment of time in their development at that ride. So the sequence of the aids is always leg, seat, hands. But the combination of how much you use of all those things, and how much with each timing, keeping in mind that they're almost simultaneous, but you might use your legs a little bit harder and a little bit more, or a little bit quicker and a little bit more, and then use your hands a little less, right? The combination shifts, right? And then obviously the more educated a horse you're on, the more subtle and quiet you can be. And then if they don't listen to the half halt, then how do you change your half halt to get your horse to do the reaction without making them hot or without making them dull, right? So that's why half halts are so insanely complicated, because there is no cookie cutter formula. It's almost like someone gave you all the ingredients to make a cake on the counter, and then they said, okay, depending on what kind of cake you want to make, you have to figure out like what ingredients to add and how much, right? And so it's like, okay, well, I know I need flour and I know I need eggs, and I know I need sugar, but I don't necessarily know how much of each. And then basically you might have to do trial and error and make a whole bunch of different cakes. But then basically, like, as you make more and more cakes and more experiment more and more, you start to realize, oh, okay, cool. If I do this and then do this and do this, then it's going to work. And then you're like, awesome. And then what happens is you go somewhere else with someone else's ingredients, or someone else's kitchen, or someone else's altitude, because that also affects cooking, I found out. And then now the cake kind of tastes the same, but it's not really the same. It's not working the same. So that's why there's all these different elements. And so a lot of it is knowing the theory behind it, and then knowing what you're feeling, what kind of reaction you're getting from your horse. So then you can adjust your ingredients in the moment in your ride. Does that all make sense? Hopefully you guys are all following me and you're not just like, what is she talking about? Um, what else was on my list? I wanted to go a little bit into the timing of the gaits, and right, because I know we went through a little bit why the half halts are all different and things like that. I want to go a little bit in the timing of the gaits because it is important. When we think about the half halt, because it's a rebalancing of energy, you have to influence the horse at the right moment in the stride of the gait that they can do something. So in the walk and the trot, it's a lot easier to influence the horse with a half halt, because the gait is balanced, meaning like you could be going straight and you could turn left or right and you'd be in balance, right? Whereas in the canter, because we have a left lead and a right lead, the timing is much more important because it's much easier to mess up. So with that, in when we think about a half halt, we want to influence the horse, apply our half halt when the inside hind leg is coming off the ground, because when it's coming off the ground, that's when the energy can be shifted back on the hindquarters. So if, say, for example, they're in the canter, it's when the mane flies up, when our butt is at the back part of the saddle, right? That's when the one hind leg is on the ground and the diagonal pair and the other front are in the air, right? That's when we can influence the stride and shorten it or collect it, rebalance it, in other words, right? So, right? In the walk and the trot, it's the same thing. It's that timing with the inside hind leg. But like I said, you don't need to worry as much about the timing, because basically there's usually a hind leg coming off, right? So it's a little bit easier to think about. Hope that makes all sense. And then when you think about in the timing for your lateral work, you still have to think about in the gait, and then you have to also coordinate your bending aids and what other aids you're putting on, right? So it gets very complicated very quickly. And then on top of it all, if your rider position isn't in balance, and you're saying half halt, half halt, half halt, you can't actually apply your aids correctly. Slash, if you're leaning forward, right, how is your horse supposed to get themselves on their hind leg if you're on their forehand, right? So you also have to think about your rider position. There's a ton that goes into half halts if you haven't figured that out. I've talked about going by feeling back to neutral, talked about the timing of the aids. Let me talk a little bit, because I briefly touched on the fact that your half halt should be your leg, your seat, and then your hands, right? When we think about our leg, we want to use the leg to energize the hind legs, to keep them coming up and underneath. And then we want to use our core to adjust the rhythm so that we can influence the rhythm. And then we use our hands to back the seat up. So we always use it in that sequence so that we don't jam our horse on the forehand, right? Because if you think about if we put the handbrake on first and then added leg, they would go, "Ugh," right? Very eloquent there. Kind of think about it like when you're driving in a car and it's on cruise control, right? That's when you're neutral when you're riding. If you were to all of a sudden slam on the brakes, you'd go pitching forward, right? And then, and then because a car is different than a horse, essentially what we do is we say, okay, we're going to slow down, we're going to put our brake on. But before we do that, we're going to energize our horse, use our legs so that their hind legs keep moving underneath so that they know not to just stutter out on us and that they can recycle the energy to the hind end and then become more collected. Much easier said than done, right? I had a point on that and now I forget what it is. I can't remember. Moving on. I see I have a question in the chat and I'm going to jump over to our list of questions. Hopefully that gives you a little bit of an idea why half-halts are so complicated, how much more goes into half-halts. Like I said, I could be here for 5 hours giving you a lecture about it. And Amelia was like very strict. She's like, don't go on forever. Keep it simple. And I was like, okay, keep it simple, keep it simple. Hannah's asking, do you have any advice for the canter to trot transition when the horse is getting the idea to trot? I have tried to start to post to break up the canter rhythm, but Valentine keeps cantering. When the horse is not getting the idea to trot. So if you're trying to balance the canter before the trot transition, but then he's not trotting when you go to ask for trot, what typically that means is that you have, you might still be taking a little bit too much in your hands. Make sure that he's not still on the muscle on his mouth. So when we think about it, we want to be able to soften in that moment of collection, right? And so when we think about the half halt also into the trot for the canter, especially for a horse like Valentina, who's, working at the fourth level, he's starting to get he can start to sit quite a bit in the canter and he goes, yeah, mama, I guess I can. What you can do is what you do want to think about changing the rhythm in your seat. And what you can do is you can ask for a little bit of bend while you're half halting and then think about the timing of your trot aid, right? It's the same thing as your canter aid and your half halt. You have to time it at the right moment. And if you put him on that bending line, it will be harder for him to maintain it. And then you can get in with your seat a little bit more to get him into the trot. And then if he isn't listening to that trot change of trot in your seat from the canter motion to the trot motion, it means that the canter to the trot motion, it means that you're too much on your hands and not as much on your seat. So then I would go back and do more forward and back in the canter, more adjustability in the canter, really using your seat as the main differentiation and then your leg and hand to back it up. Because then what will happen is then he'll be listening to your seat more. And then hopefully he'll feel the change from the canter motion to the trot motion more easily. Hope that helps. Stacy says today, even when I even thought half halt, he would break. So should I just think with my core and add leg only? Yeah. So remember, sometimes when we think things, our body changes, right? So it's really important that when we start to prepare, right, we don't change anything yet in our body. And so he's probably actually, being more sensitive than you realize and listening in a little bit. And then so what you want to think about is when you go to ask for your half halt to rebalance, add a little bit more leg and a little less hand, right? And then what you want to feel like is that if you feel them start to kind of, a little bit, start to go forward. Sometimes when a horse is learning to half halt, they half halt too much, like they react too much. So then you have to just balance it. And that's where it gets so hard and so confusing, is because at the beginning of your ride, Stacy, it probably feels a little different to the end of your ride. But essentially, you just have to change that amount, change your cake ingredients to suit him a little bit more. It's okay to do two or three half halts, and they're not perfect, and until you figure out exactly what the right formula is. Great. All right. I have those questions that everyone said. Feel free to put more in the chat if you have them. I see that there's quite a few people here and there's no questions yet. So either I'm brilliant and I've just demystified half-halts for you guys completely, which I will take that compliment, or maybe some of you are a little shy to ask, but feel free to ask away. All right, I'm going to start off with a question from Emma. She says, my mare keeps getting strong in the half-halt even with the leg on. Anything I can do besides giving with one rein or leg yielding through it, working on straightness. Winter has us on the muscle big time. Yeah, so a little bit similar to Hannah's horse that, doesn't have the reaction that we want. So we have to go back and make the half halt simpler, right? So in that sense, um, if she's getting strong in your reins, think about going back to what your neutral is, right? Can you go back to a neutral that isn't as collected, right? You aren't asking for that much degree of collection, and then you have exactly the right idea. You want to have a bit of bend into it. So leg yield is great, or even on a circle line, like a 20 or 15-meter circle, asking them to bend around. Really be conscientious of your rider position. Like I said, check in with yourself that your shoulders are back, and down, your hips are in the correct alignment, your legs are underneath you. If you're bending, one leg should be behind and one leg should be at the curve. Check in with yourself, because that will be a big determining factor. And then the other thing with them, if they're getting hotter or heavier throughout the ride, is to keep checking in with them earlier, to do some of those transitions before they get a little hot, so that you have a little bit more a check-in or understanding. Great question. Patty says, my guy is heavy on the left rein, hollow on the right. I am really working on not holding on the left. Awesome. But how do I half halt when the horse leans on one rein? Great question, Patty. So for any horse that is like uneven, like they tend to take one rein more the other, the best thing that you can do is changing the direction frequently to try and get back to that evenness on both sides. So if he's really easy to bend to the right, hollow right means that he's really easy to bend to the right. I want you to be thinking, even when I'm going right, can I add a little bit of left leg and do outside leg to inside rein and use that a little bit in your half halts as well? So I don't necessarily want you to do that when you're like on a 10-meter circle because you still need to have bend. But when you're doing like wider turns, it's essentially what you're doing is you're reconnecting that hind leg to the other rein. It's the same process. We just sometimes forget, oh yeah, you can do it the other way too, but we often don't because we need bend, and that's why we do it that way. But lots and lots of changes of direction to help even that out. And if you find yourself all of a sudden having nothing in your right hand and too much in your left hand, change direction, and that will help you there. A question from New Rob. Can you explain when you would half halt with both legs and hands versus only the inside or outside? Yeah, great question. So as we get more sophisticated in our half halts and we're doing different things and the horse is giving us different reactions. So on a 3-year-old, I'm really just saying, go forward and then can wait for me, right? My half-halts are very spread apart, very clear and defined. Like, here's the go aid. Oh, good. Now here's the come back aid. Here's the go aid. Here's the come back aid, right? And then as we get more sophisticated and we're doing a half halt in a lateral movement, when we're trying to connect the inside leg to the outside rein a little bit more. But it's important to remember that those prerequisites come when you have connection. So essentially, I would start in the horse's development doing the more like diagonal pair half halt once the horse is consistently round and I'm able to maintain the roundness, or I need that lateral connection to continue getting my roundness. If your horse isn't rounded on the bit yet, don't really need to do it because it doesn't really, like, the horse isn't moving to the outside rein, right? The horse has to be able to move away from the inside leg independently of just going forward. So I hope that makes an understanding. The horse has to have a knowledge of that, like both legs on means go and one leg means on bend. And then when you have that, that's when you can start using the diagonal legs. That's a really good question. I should tell that one time, Elia. Sometimes we have like philosophical, like dressage debates about things, and that's a really good one because that's an excellent question. We have one from Lislin, and I apologize. The connection of breathing and half halts. Ooh, I love this one. So Breathing definitely helps our half halts. Breathing helps our riding in general. And the reason why is because when we are breathing, it allows our hips to move in the rhythm of the horse. So remember how we were talking with Hannah, how the rhythm of the horse and rhythm of the gaits really affects the half halt? So essentially, if you're holding your pelvis still, you kind of always, like if you're holding your breath and not really moving, you're essentially not moving with the rhythm. And then you're already at like a 6 of holding. So when you go to an 8 of holding for your half halt, you don't, the horse is like, I don't feel the difference, right? In addition to that, when we breathe and when we're going and we like blow out the birthday candles, it's activating the correct muscles in our core that we use in our seat muscles when we do a half halt. So if you've ever done Pilates and they tell you to like engage your core and like breathe out through your diaphragm, like that little like right, like you're blowing out a birthday cake, or you're trying to like move a paper that's in front of your face. The other expression that I sometimes use is pretend you're doing a Kegel. It's kind of the same idea. Amelia likes saying like pretend you're zipping up your jeans, and like if you're tight jeans, like you kind of have to suck it in and go right. Like it's the same kind. It's that motion of you breathing. It's engaging those core, and that's why there's such a massive connection with your half halt, not just because of your rhythm, but because it's the same muscles that you're activating when you're doing the half halt. Really good question. I am loving these questions. I always say that I get the best questions when I substitute. Really good one. Um, yeah, and then Emma's asking, why do we half hold our lungs when we're doing it? Because you're probably clutching your butt instead of using your glute med, which is the muscle on the side of your buttocks, and your oblique muscles. You should be using those, not gripping your butt. If you're gripping your butt to do your half halt, it just actually makes you bounce out of the saddle. So that's also really cool about it, is because when you're using the correct muscles, you can keep breathing in your half halt. Great questions. Hillcrest Staple is asking, could you do a little refresher on the timing of the A's for various gaits and actions? Okay, I did do that a little bit. For example, if you want to collect the trot, sequence legs, feet, hands, question mark, and on what part of stride, every other stride, when the front leg is in the air, or just when leaving the ground, question mark. Okay, yeah, so a lot of questions in there. But essentially, like I said, you want to influence the horse when the inside hind leg is off the ground, right? So in the canter, that's the step, that's beat 1. In the trot, it's beat 1 as well. In the walk, it's beat 1 as well, actually. It's always beat 1 of whatever gait it is. The trouble is with the trot and the walk is that beat 1 is wherever you start counting, but you should always be starting counting for the walk on the one of the hind legs. And then in the trot, I would always do it with the outside hind leg down. That just makes sense in my brain, because that's when the inside hind leg is up. Really great question there. And then they're asking, how do you know the timing for the canter and everything like that? It's pretty much no matter if you're doing a pirouette, if you're doing a half pass, if whatever exercise you're doing, it's going to be the same timing. But what's interesting about some of the exercises, some of the dressage movements, is that they actually make your horse naturally more connected. So then you might have to change. That's where it also gets confusing, is that if you have a horse that's naturally rushy and you need to usually rebalance them on their hind legs, but they've got a really good shoulder in, you might actually need to use your half halt in the shoulder in to activate the hind leg to make sure they keep it energized and moving underneath themselves, because the shoulder in itself will collect the horse. That's why it gets so confusing. And then sometimes horses just rush in the shoulder, and then you still have to do your collecting half halt, right? So it's the same timing, because you focus on the gait more so than the movement itself. But the other thing to think about is when you're doing something like a pirouette, or you're doing something like a pirouette, or either walk or canter, or a rein back, you should already be collected before you go into the movement. Meaning, when you're approaching your pirouette, you should already be in a collected walk. You should already have that walk smaller and more engaged for them to do the pirouette. And the same thing in the canter. And then you might use a half halt through it. And that's when going back to that great question about the diagonal aids, that's where you probably use a little bit more diagonal aids to help maintain the bend through that exercise. Really great questions. I hope that helps answer. I know that's like not as specific per movement, but that's also what makes it, like I said, so complicated, is because depending on how your horse is reacting to the half halt in the movement, depends on how much of each aid you would have to use. But remember, it's always leg, then seat, then hand. Great question. Shari says the constant reminder to do them. Almost before you realize you need them. Yes. Somehow, like it's hard because you have to. That's a mental thing more than a training thing for your horse. And what I like to say is, you have to think about using every corner. Think about you could come out of any corner and do something, right? Use the corner and the half halt, but use the corner as a reminder to do the half halt to prepare you for what's coming, 1 stride, 2 stride, 3 strides down out of that corner. And that will really help you. The other thing to think about is going back to neutral. Anytime you feel like you're not in neutral, you need to do a half halt. There are cases where like you don't want to do a half halt every single stride, but then you have to do other things to help maintain that balance. Great question. Lucy says, explaining it to the young horse. Yes. So, like I said, the half halt changes depending on the development of the horse, right? A Grand Prix horse, you might just need to engage your core a little bit and they would shift back. You might just need to use a little bit of leg and a little bit of halting of your seat, like hesitation of your seat and a little tightness of the fingers. Very subtle, very quiet, very in balance and in the moment. And you can hardly see anything. Whereas a young horse, you might have to go, okay, we're really shifting back, right? What you want to think about with a young horse that really doesn't understand the concept of a half halt yet, if you try and apply the aids closer together, essentially like you would for a Grand Prix horse or more subtly, they probably won't notice it if it's really subtle, or they'll get frustrated because you have your leg and your hands on at the same time. So the way I train it is an exercise called Go Come Back to Me. And it's very similar to the elastic band exercise, if you guys are familiar with that. Essentially, you put your horse on a 20-meter circle and you're going to say, okay, we're going to go forward. Good horse. And then when you feel them starting to go forward in a more energetic way from your leg, then you're going to say, great, now come back to me. And you're going to slow your seat. You're going to ask for a little bit of bend. You might close your fingers and say, you might breathe out, sit a little heavier, right? And say, ooh, right? And then they're going to come back and you say, great job. And then you're going to say, okay, now they're going to go forward again. So there is going to be an element of lengthening the stride and shortening the stride, and maybe even quickening of the tempo and shortening of the tempo. You don't really want the tempo to go forward and back. But oftentimes with a young horse, it happens a little bit because you're trying to get them to understand the concept of, yes, leg means forward and like seat and hand mean whoa, right? And so it's basically continued repetition of that. And then basically you make the aids smaller and smaller together. So, they only go forward for 2 or 3 steps. And then they come back and, and then they can go forward for 1 and then come back. And then all of a sudden you're doing it at the same time and they kind of understand it. The other thing to remember with the half halt is that you're not going to get the degree of balance and collection in a young horse as you are going to be on a horse that's a first level or a second level or a third level or higher horse, right? So it's adjusting your expectations of what that neutral level frame and balance is, right? It should still be you should still have clear rhythm, and you should still, you shouldn't be rushing in the tempo or too slow in the tempo, but it's not going to be it's not going to be Harvey up there super collected underneath himself, right? It's going to be, no, he's also collected. I don't have another good photo around here. I'm sorry. I'm going to have to tell Amelia she's going to need more photos. But it's not going to look like the Piaffe, right? So remember that. Think about it as like someone watching shouldn't notice a big change in the tempo. When you're videoing yourself and you're like, that was supposed to be an extension. What happened? That's the feeling that you want. You want to just feel a slight amount and then come back, right? Just so that you can kind of feel it. And that's how I train the young horses to kind of understand the concept when it's more simply and more less educated. Great question. Barbara says, all of it. I was told by my trainer I'm doing them subconsciously, but I'm 100% unaware. Yeah, that's probably because you're just rebalancing and you've got a great sense of feel with your horse and you're doing it without realizing, which is awesome. Betsy says, how do you do them? When do you do them? How do you know if they're effective? Okay, so how to do them, like I said, the leg, the seat, and the hands. We can go into a whole bunch more complicated, like I said, about the development of the horse, whatever movement you're in, how the horse is feeling that day, what combination of you're making your cake, when to do them. Like I said, in the timing of the stride, it's when the inside hind leg is coming off the ground, or when it's you're about to prepare for a movement or a gait change or transition, right? That goes back to that definition of it's to regain attention and balance before a movement or transition. And then how do you know if they're effective? Can you feel the energy shift? Like in a horse that is actually doing a proper half halt, a more educated half, like more in the so than just a baby horse, you should feel a change in the balance. And then you have more of a neutral where you're like, oh, my horse isn't leaning on my hands. My horse isn't behind the leg. They're going at this cruise control that feels really comfortable. It might only happen for 3 or 4 strides before you have to change something and correct it again. But essentially, when you have that neutral, more in balance, that where at that moment, you're in balance because you could ask them to do something that they know how to do in the further level of their training, and they can physically do it. So, for example, if you're in balance for the horse that is a first level horse, right? And they're in balance, they're going to be able to go from trot to canter really well, really easily, and within good timing without changing their frame and connection. If you have a horse that's imbalanced in first level and you're trying to teach the walk to canter, it might struggle. Even if the half halt has worked, they're still going to struggle with the concept of it because they don't understand what the aids from walk to canter are just yet. So that's important to remember when you're assessing if your half halt has worked, that you're using it on, like if your half halt is being effective, I should say, is that you're using it on something that your horse can do. And then when you've established that in that ride for that day, then when you go to do something more complicated, you have a half halt that works, and then you feel it and adjust it depending on if your horse gets lazier or hotter, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Great questions. All right, that was all the questions I had. So there's no more, which is hard to imagine. And I've gone over the time allotted that Amelia said I wanted to do. But like I said, there's so much more that we could talk about. Amelia does have a course all about half halts. It's pretty darn cool. There's 2 full-length lectures, and then 10 videos, exercises teaching you all about the how, the what, the where. She has one specifically on the more of like what you do with your body, more than just like leg, seat, hand. She goes into it with greater detail. And the theory lectures are pretty cool. I took some notes. It's the definition and the purpose, the biomechanics, the aids, how to apply each part of the aids, what do all your body parts do in the half halt, the timing of the half halt, what do you do when you can't put your leg on in the half halt, how do you know your half halt works, what do you do if your horse isn't listening to the half halt, the anatomy of the horse and how that affects the half halt, how many half halts are too many, and common rider faults in the half halt, right? So there's a ton to go on. And what's also really cool about that course is there's a demo in there that she does live at the Horse Expo, where it's 2 very different horses, and one is about energizing and activating the horse's hind leg, and the other one is about settling the horse and making them a little bit softer and more regulated. So it's a really cool demo. Stacy says, you packed so much into 30 minutes. Oh, good. I'm glad. Betsy's asking, how do you feel when the hind leg is moving on count 1? Okay, this is my last question. I'll let you guys go. And actually, let me grab that page for the half halt, because I want to make sure that everyone has access to it. Oh, gosh, Amelia's computer is different. Paste. Okay. In the chat is the link if you want to check out the half halt workshop. There's also a little mini lecture at the beginning on the sale page if you want to take a peek at it. And then I will go Betsy's question. Betsy's question was, how do you feel when the hind leg is on count 1? Right. So in the canter, it's the easiest way to tell because that's when the mane is up. That's when your bum is in the back part of the saddle, because when we think about our canter, our seat goes in that circular motion, right? So it's when the seat is at the back. That's when the mane is up, and that's when they're on beat 1. In the trot, it is when you're rising out of the saddle. It's when because of the diagonal pairs, right? That's also why it's kind of hard to do an effective half halt in posting trot. And that's a whole other discussion for the day of whether or not sitting trot should be allowed or not, because theoretically we can't do an effective half halt and influence our horse's leg if we are out of the tack. Debate for another day, but that's essentially that beat is when you're rising. in the trot, or when the outside leg is rising and the diagonal pair, that's when you know the inside hind leg is rising. And then in the walk, ooh, and that's my that's my timer to tell me that I've gone too long. And then in the walk, when you know when you're walking and you can feel the barrel go side to side, when the barrel starts to go to the right, to the outside, and it's at the peak of where it is on how much it's going to move over to the side, that's when the inside hind leg is as far up in the air as it will be. So as your seat starts to passes center and starts to swish over to the outside, that's when you want to apply your leg or your half halt, because that is the moment when the leg is coming up out of the air. Great. All right, I'm gonna let you guys go since I've gone too much overtime, but I hope you guys have enjoyed it. This is just a taste of everything that has to do with half halts. And I do hope you'll check out the course. It is a great one. I refer back to it quite a bit. It's good fun. And like I said, it's jam packed. Like I said, 2 full length lectures, 10 exercises to practice your half halts for hot horses, lazy horses, horses that are long in the back, horses that need to be re energized. If you're starting to figure it out, your rider position for half halts and everything else. All right. Thank you so much, everyone. Have a lovely rest of your evening.